Well, thank you, Courtney. I can see exactly why you were Delaware's Teacher of the Year. And can we hear it once again for Courtney? But I have to say, as I travel around the state and visit schools, which I do every single week, there are so many people who strike me just like you, so many passionate, committed professionals to the children of Delaware. Thanks so much for your service. It is, for me, really a pleasure as we continue our journey toward making Delaware schools world-class to welcome the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, Arne Duncan. Nobody has spoken more eloquently about education reform and its urgency than our keynote speaker today. Now, many of you probably know the Secretary's background. Prior to his appointment by President Obama, the Secretary served for several years as the Chief Executive Officer of the Chicago Public Schools, where he oversaw a number of significant education reform successes. Before joining the Chicago Public Schools, he ran a nonprofit education foundation that helped fund a college education for a class of inner-city children. And he was part of a team that later started a new public elementary school built around a financial literacy curriculum that still today ranks among the top elementary schools in Chicago. And when it came time for President Obama to select a secretary for the Department of Education, the president did not look to somebody who had watched educational improvement efforts from the sidelines. He looked to somebody who had actually done it, somebody who recognized the imperative of educational improvement and who truly understood the challenges of making reform a reality. And in his confirmation hearings, Secretary Duncan called education the most pressing issue facing America, and he added that preparing young people for success in life is not just a moral obligation of society, but also an economic imperative. He said education is also the civil rights issue of our generation, the only sure path out of poverty and the only way to achieve a more equal and just society. Now, let me make one personal point. Secretary Duncan and Secretary Lowry and I spent about a day and a half together in June at the Hunt Institute in North Carolina. This is a leader who understands that our decisions must be based on what's right for kids. He goes to battle for them every single day. He may be the most plain-spoken cabinet member that I've ever met, heard of, and just had the chance to observe. He's not afraid to step on toes, to offend people along the way, because he really only cares about one thing, and that is whether or not the kids of this country can in fact achieve their potential. We welcome that message to Delaware, and we're honored to have the Secretary here with us to share his thoughts on how we can make educational improvement a reality. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Arne Duncan.
Thank you so much, Governor. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for that kind introduction. And I don't just say that because I'm with him today, but we had about half the nation's governors spending, as you said, a day and a half in education. And your governor here, amongst that elite group, really stood out as someone with absolute passion, absolute commitment, and you guys are very, very lucky to have a leader like him. Please give him another round of applause. To President Harker, thank you so much for hosting us today. To Courtney Fox, wow, phenomenal. If we can just clone teachers like that, clone principals like that, we could all retire and go to the Bahamas. That leadership, that passion, that commitment, that enthusiasm is infectious. Lillian Lowry, thank you so much for your leadership. It's an absolute honor to be here. It's amazing time to be working in education in this country. It's a time, as you all know, of real crisis. We have the toughest economy, probably since the Depression. A couple wars we're also fighting. It's also a time of education crisis. If you've looked at any of the national trends, NAEP scores are flat, not making progress that we want. Achievement gaps still stubbornly large. On a recent examination of 15-year-olds in terms of their math abilities, the United States ranked 31st internationally. That's not sort of who we think we are, but that's the reality. But probably the most devastating numbers, as a country, we have about a 30% dropout rate. And that 30% equates to 1.2 million students every single year leaving school. And there was a time in this country when you could drop out and get a good job. I'm from Chicago. There was a time 30 years ago you could drop out at 16 or 17 and go work in the stockyards or steel mills and own your own home and support a family and have a pretty good life. We know there are basically no good jobs out there. And all of those students who drop out are basically condemned to poverty and social failure. And so how as a country do we get dramatically better? And I don't want to come here 2 years from now and say we're heroes, we're down to 28% or 29%. How do we get that number down to zero absolutely as fast as we can? How do we dramatically reduce the dropout rate, dramatically increase the graduation rate, and make sure many more of our high school graduates are both college and career ready? That's what this is about. The president has drawn a line in the sand. He has said by the year 2020, we have to again lead the world in the percent of college graduates. Again, we used to lead the world probably 2.5 decades ago. We've flatlined, we've stagnated, many other countries have passed us by, and collectively we pay a price. And so everything we do is towards that end. So a time of huge challenges, time you could say of crisis, but it's also a time of great opportunity. And the President's Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, has a great line, never waste a good crisis. Well, we have a couple good crises on our hands, and it's often in times of crisis, whether we like it or not, it's often in times of crisis that we get the kinds of breakthroughs we need. And so we really do see this as a huge opportunity. What the President has laid out is an absolutely comprehensive education agenda. Some have said it's too ambitious, early childhood, K-12, higher ed. I tell you, I would love to be able to focus just on one of those areas, just on K-12 or just higher ed or just early childhood, but I think we have to get dramatically better at all of those areas, and we have to do it now in order to get where we need to go. So I want to walk through quickly what we're trying to do and then really focus on the K-12 agenda that's the heart of your conversation today. On the early childhood side, I think a pretty good case could be made that nationally that's the best investment we can make. If we can get our 2 and our 3 and our 4-year-olds off to a good start, if we can level the playing field, they can hit kindergarten with their literacy and socialization skills intact, then we're in great, great shape. I wonder how the best kindergarten teachers in the world, I wonder how they teach to a class where students come in reading fluently and other students come in who don't know the front of the book from the back of a book, who sometimes don't even know their name. They've been called a nickname all their life. How does the best teacher differentiate instruction in those extremes? In education, we have to get out of the catch-up business. At every level, we're catching up. Universities have to offer too many remedial classes. High schools are doing too much of what doesn't happen in middle school. And ultimately, for us to get out of the catch-up game, to me, it goes back to great early childhood education. So through the stimulus package, $5 billion to invest there. Through a bill that's passed the House and is going before the Senate now, another $8 billion over the next 8 years to invest in early childhood education. Unprecedented investments to do two things. One, dramatically increase access, and 2, to dramatically improve quality. We have to make sure that every child, but particularly children from disadvantaged communities, have a chance to get that great foundation, and we have to make sure those early childhood programs aren't glorified babysitting. If that's what it is, it's not going to get us where we need to go. So a huge play there. K-12, I'll come back and close on that, jump ahead to higher education. And again, at the end of the day, all of this is about not just access, but attainment, trying to dramatically increase the number of our young people graduating from college. So huge investment in the community college system. That's been sort of, I think, the unpolished, the unrecognized jewel along the education continuum, whether it's healthcare jobs, tech jobs, green energy jobs. As the country gets back on its feet and as families get back on its feet, we think community colleges are going to play a huge role there. We're trying to dramatically improve what's happening there. Huge new resources to make college more affordable, and I worry about it at a time when going to college has never been more important. It's never been more expensive, and as all of you know, families have never been under more financial pressure. So historic increases in Pell Grants, Perkins loans, tuition tax credits, over $30 billion already there, another $70 billion coming in this package if it passes the Senate. So a chance to really make sure that every child has a chance to go to college. And I worry about those dreams dying young. I worry about those 10 and 11-year-olds who are working hard, who are smart, who are committed, but mom or dad loses a job or takes a 50% pay cut, and they start to think college isn't for them. And we need to be able to look every young person in the eye, not at 17 or 18, but at 10, 11, 12, and say, if you do the right thing, if you work hard, that opportunity is going to be there. So a huge push there, a huge push to dramatically simplify the financial aid form and the FAFSA form. For those of you who are parents who have gone through that form, the form itself is a barrier to entry. It's been crazy. And you basically have to have a PhD to figure it out. And the problem with that is most people going to college don't have a PhD yet. That's why they're going to college. And I worry not just about audiences like these, but first generation going to college, English language learners, how do those families overcome that barrier? So dramatically simplifying that. And then finally, something that is the law now, we don't have to fight for it, passed July 1st, that I think is hugely important, is called income-based repayment. In areas like education, in public sector work, in nonprofit work, historically we've lost lots of great talent who wanted to come help us help children, but couldn't afford to do that because they had loans of $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 or more. With income-based repayment now, and again it's the law, as young people graduate from college, their loan repayments will be indexed to their income. And so there'll be significant reductions there if you're teaching, if you're in the public sector, if you work for a nonprofit. And then if you stay in that line of work for 10 years, whatever loans you have will be erased at that point, will be forgiven. And so it's a real chance for us going forward to bring great talent into sectors and let people follow their heart, follow their passion, and not pursue something that's more lucrative just because they're stuck with the loans. So very significant breakthroughs at the higher ed level, trying to increase access, to focus on completion, to focus on community colleges, and to make sure that talent can follow where that talent needs to go. On the K-12 side, we're pushing a very strong agenda. I know you had some great conversations I heard about this morning. Let me just sort of walk through where we're at and where we're trying to go. We've had unprecedented resources to try and stabilize what was going on. Over $70 billion came into K-12 education to make sure we didn't have this education catastrophe. We've saved about 250,000 jobs around the country, and at a time when local economies at the state level, at the district level, have never been tougher. We thought if we went from class size of 25 to 40, if we laid off tens of thousands of social workers and librarians and counselors, we'd take a huge step backwards. So we think we've been able fairly effectively to stave off an education catastrophe. Unfortunately, as we all know, there have still been layoffs. We weren't able to do everything we would have liked to have done. But at a time when we have to get dramatically better, we couldn't afford to take a huge step backwards. So it's been a major push. But the second thing we have is not just money to stabilize what's going on, but money to drive change. And we think we have to get dramatically better. Again, with a dropout rate of 30%, with far too many of those who do graduate from high school having to take remedial classes in college, far too many of those who try and go into 2-year or 4-year institutions simply don't have the skills to be successful. We think simply investing, just propping up the status quo, doesn't get us as a country where we need to go. And we've been given this extraordinary gift. Thanks to the President's leadership, thanks to the bipartisan support of Congress, we've never had more discretionary resources, not just formula resources, but discretionary resources. I talked to Secretary Page, my good friend, who was a secretary before, Margaret Spellings. He had about $17 million in discretionary resources. We have north of $10 billion. Night and day, 17 million, 10 billion. And I know you guys are focused on the Race to the Top fund, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. $4.35 billion there. But beyond that, on top of that, $3.5 billion school improvement grants, hundreds of millions of dollars teacher incentive fund, hundreds of millions of dollars coming for our Promised Neighborhoods initiative, money for data systems, money for educational technology. We have this chance of a lifetime, this amazing opportunity to invest in what's working at the local level. And I always joke that when I was in Chicago, when I got a call from the Department of Education in Washington, that wasn't a call I looked forward to. It was always about a compliance report. It was always about an audit. It was never about teaching a child to read. It was never about reducing the dropout rate. And we're trying to fundamentally change the business we're in. We've been this large compliance-driven bureaucracy, and we're trying to walk away from that and every day look in the mirror and be very self-critical and try and become the engine of innovation, to scale up what works and share best practices and shine a spotlight on what's happening. The best ideas in education are never going to come from Washington. They're always going to come from at the local level. Great principals, great teachers, great superintendents, great districts making a difference in students' lives. And we have this amazing opportunity to invest in what works and scale up what works and take those best practices where we're both shrinking the achievement gap and raising the bar for our children to take those to a different level. What are we looking for? So with all these discretionary resources, not just Race to the Top, but school improvement grants, teacher incentive fund right down the line, we're looking for a couple things. And I think Delaware has a real chance to lead here. First of all, we're looking to raise the bar significantly, to raise standards. One of the many problems under No Child Left Behind was that due to political pressure in many states, including the state that I'm from Illinois, those standards got dummied down. They got lowered. And we think we have to raise the bar dramatically. When you talk about having Delaware lead not just the country but the world, we have to raise the bar. In many places, including Illinois where I'm from, we have basically lied to children and to parents. And let me explain what I mean. When a child or a parent is told they are quote-unquote meeting a state standard, they assume, logically, rationally, that they're on track to be successful. But in many places, those standards have been dummied down so much that that child who is quote-unquote meeting a state standard in 3rd or 5th or 7th grade is barely prepared to graduate from high school and is absolutely woefully underprepared to go to a competitive university, let alone graduate. So we have to raise the bar dramatically. And Delaware is one of 48 states that are working together to think about common higher standards. This was probably 2 or 3 years ago the third rail in education. You couldn't talk about this. But now you have 48 governors, including yours, 48 state school chiefs, the heads of both major national unions, the business community, nonprofits, all working together to do the right thing by children. Still a long way to go, still early in the process, but extraordinarily encouraging work. And we have a chance, not as 50 states, but as a country, to break through on this. Behind that, when you get higher standards, we need better assessments. We need better assessments. And we're put on the table $350 million to invest on a competitive basis on those states and those districts that want to work together to have better assessments. We can't just assess students at the end of the year. I often say when you get those test results in June or July, that student's gone on to the next grade, nothing changes for the child. The teacher's held accountable, the school's held accountable. That's all maybe part of the equation, but what are we doing for the child? How do we have real-time data so that teachers can differentiate instruction, formative data? And I think Delaware is really working hard to break through, particularly on the K-8 level. There's a chance to give our best teachers better tools that help them reach every single child in real time and not just in the summer. So as we think about end-of-year assessments, summative, I want to have a much bigger focus on those formative assessments that help everyone, teachers, parents, and students, understand their strengths and their weaknesses, and how do we all work together, not just during the school day, but after school, at home on the weekends, to help every single child be successful. So a fundamental chance to break through. We were concerned that states wanted to do the right thing, but due to the economic pressure everyone's feeling, wouldn't be able to do that. So again, unprecedented resources, $350 million on the table to help those states take that next step. Secondly, we have to think about how we use data. And data can be scary, and I understand that. Data can be scary to folks. But I think, again, we need to get out of the business of lying to children, and we need to get out of the business of surprising students. And what was always heartbreaking to me in Chicago was see students who worked pretty hard and tried to do the right thing, who got to high school, been to school every day, got decent grades, and then they got like a 15 on the ACT, and were stunned. They just simply weren't prepared. They had tried to do the right thing. There shouldn't be any surprises in education. Our juniors and seniors should know, we should all know exactly where they are all the way along the line. So how do we track our students' data, elementary, early childhood, elementary, middle school, high school, on through college? How do we track their trajectory and make sure they don't get lost? How do we track students to teachers so that we understand which teachers and which schools are making the biggest difference in our students' lives? How do we track that data back to schools of education so we understand which schools of education are producing the teachers that are producing the students that are learning the most? We have one state right now, Louisiana, that's doing this. And it's not done in a punitive manner. It's not done in a gotcha manner. In fact, what we're seeing is due to longitudinal data, hundreds of thousands of students, tens of thousands of teachers. What we're seeing is schools of education starting to adjust and strengthen their curriculum so that they're addressing where the weaknesses, not just of their alumni, but of their alumni students. That's what this is about. It's about continuous improvement. And again, I think there's a chance as a country to break through on this. It's not so much a technological battle, it's a battle of courage. It's a battle of political will. So we've got plenty of money on the table to do that, but we want to invest in those places that are willing to have those conversations and make those kinds of adjustments. I think there's some real places you can learn from. Third, and these last two are probably the toughest. I know you spent some time this morning. How do we think about great talent? In education, talent matters tremendously. Great teachers, great principals make an extraordinary difference in our students' lives. In education, we talk so much about the achievement gap, and the achievement gap is real, it is insidious, it is in every state, every place in the country. I'm much more focused on the achievement gap of what I call the opportunity gap. And what I'm convinced is that poor children, disadvantaged children, children whose families don't have a history of academic success, if those students have a chance to go to great schools with great teachers and great principals, they're going to go on to do extraordinarily well. And if we can close the opportunity gap, we can close the achievement gap. So how do we systemically get the best teachers, the most committed teachers, the best principals to those children and those communities that have been historically underserved? And in many places, there have been lots of disincentives to do that structurally, very few incentives. How do we try and flip that? And how do we make the capstone of a teacher or principal's career going into those tough communities and really transform the educational opportunities structure for those children, those communities? How we think about that collectively, I think, is very, very important. Again, some pockets of excellence, but not enough places where this is happening systemically. And then the final piece is how do we turn around schools that are chronically underperforming? And I know my buddy Andre here spoke to you this morning. He's a pretty remarkable leader. And in many places, schools are getting dramatically better. The best schools in this state, the best schools in this country, are amongst the best schools in the world, and we need to learn from them, replicate those successes, shine a spotlight on them. But I've tried to get the country to start to engage in a conversation. Let's not think about the 99%, not the 10% at the top, not all those are getting better. But as a country, let's think about the bottom 1%, however you want to define it, at the local level, at the state level, whatever that bottom 1% looks like. Can we stop to tinkering around the edges? Can we stop looking at incremental change and do something dramatically different? We talked about a 30% national dropout rate. I talked about 1.2 million students a year dropping out. 2,000 high schools in this country. We have 100,000 schools. 2,000 high schools produce half of our nation's dropouts, 50%. Those 2,000 high schools produce 75% of our dropouts from the minority community, our African American, Latino young boys and girls. That's unacceptable. And what's most troubling to me is in many places that hasn't been true for a year or 2 years or 5 years. That's been true for decades, 10, 20, 30 years. We have to draw a line in the sand and say enough is enough and do something dramatically different in those situations. Fundamentally change those opportunity structures and turn around those schools. What Andre and his team have done at the Harvard School and at other schools in Chicago is pretty remarkable. You've seen places that were amongst the most violent in the city where violence basically ceases to exist. You've seen places where the community has fled, children and families going to any other school but that school because they were looking for better options, come back with new leadership. You've seen one school that was amongst the lowest performing, not just Chicago in the state, 3 years after the turnaround, was the largest gaining, the fastest gaining elementary school, not in Chicago, but in the state of Illinois. I visited a school about 3 weeks ago in Philadelphia, led by the Mastery Group, that 2 years ago had 25% of their students meeting state standards. And 2 years after turnaround, they were at 80%. They went from being, again, the second most violent school in Philadelphia to almost no violence. And I asked the students, what changed? Same children, same families, same neighborhoods, same buildings, same socioeconomic challenges. I asked one young man what happened before. He said, you know what, we were supposed to fight. That was expected of us. We were supposed to fight. I said, how come you're not fighting anymore? He said, we're not expected to fight anymore. Not what we're supposed to do. I said, what do you used to fight about? He said, you know what, I thought about that a lot. We used to fight about some really dumb stuff. But that was the norm. That was the expectation. We as adults didn't believe that poor young black men could behave in ways that made sense. Our expectations weren't there. New expectations, new leadership. And so this work is hard, this work is tough, but sometimes we have to have the willingness, as the governor said, to do the right thing by children. Because if we as a country did the bottom 1% of schools each year for the next 4 or 5 years, we could transform that opportunity structure. As a country, we do lots of things in the academic calendar. We order milk every year, we order lunches, we order school bunches, we hire teachers. We don't turn around schools systemically. And if we could start to do it collectively, all of us, districts and unions and states and nonprofits, never going to be the federal government, never going to be us, but if we collectively, universities, could come together to turn around those schools and transform those opportunity structures, that would be really important. Some folks say, well, this isn't really our issue. This is a New York issue. It's a Chicago issue. Those 2,000 high schools I talked about to produce half our nation's dropouts, 50% are in urban areas, 20% are in suburban areas, 30% are in rural communities. This is a national challenge. This is not an urban challenge. This is a national challenge. And I think we have to collectively, as a country, do the right thing by children. I look at Delaware's stats, lots to be proud of, lots of progress. I love the absolute commitment to, again, not just leading the country, but leading the world. But right now, today, you have 30% less 12th graders than you do 9th graders. 30% less 12th graders and 9th graders. So my question is, where are all those students going? They're not all going early to the MBA. Bill Gates, I don't think, is coming from Microsoft to recruit your 9th and 10th graders dropping out of high school. We're losing too many children to the streets. Here in Delaware, those rates of loss between 9th and 10th grade are above 40% for the Black and Latino community. It's unacceptable. So what is this community going to do to make sure that every child has a chance to be successful? So we're really at a crossroads, sort of a moment of truth. We want to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in states and districts and nonprofits that are willing to challenge the status quo and lead the country where we need to go. But they're going to be winners, and frankly, they're going to be losers. And Delaware has a chance, I think, to lead the country. This is a state of manageable size. I love the sense of collaboration. I love the mix of folks coming together, and everyone has to be at the table and work together. And Delaware can help to lead the country where we need to go. Or Delaware can decide to sort of accept the status quo, accept incremental change, and stay on the sidelines. And so it's a huge, huge moment of truth. And I appreciate the extraordinary leadership. I appreciate the many, many different people coming together. But let me be clear, at the end of the day, please don't do this for the money. Please do this because it's the right thing for children. And to do it, money alone is not going to solve these problems. We're going to invest in states and districts and nonprofits that have the political will, the courage, and the capacity, and the sense of collaboration to get this done. In education, we have dramatically underinvested as a country for far too long. Thanks to President leadership and Congress support, $100 billion in new money for education. My budget basically doubled. That never happens. That never happens in business world, never happens in the nonprofit world, never happens, I don't think, at the University of Delaware. I don't think budgets double too often. It's never enough, it's still underinvestment, but it's a remarkable opportunity. But let me be clear, the lack of investment is a piece of what has troubled us in education. The other half of the equation is what I call adult dysfunction, that we've all spent all our time fighting each other. And we all have to move outside our silos. We all have to behave in very, very different ways. We all have to stretch outside our comfort zones to do some things differently. And so we're going to challenge everyone, states and communities and teachers and principals, and very importantly, students, to do more and to do better. But let me promise you, as hard as we push everyone, we're going to try and look in the mirror and be self-critical and say we have to change too. Again, we at the Department of Education, I think, have been a big part of this problem. And if we can move from being this compliance-driven bureaucracy to the engine of innovation, then hopefully we stop being part of the problem and we start being part of the solution. But I just ask you and implore all of you to think about having those conversations, which I know you're already doing. You're not going to agree on everything, but keep coming together. Stay at the table. None of us, in our own little silos, none of us can reduce the dropout rate fast enough. All of us working together have a chance. Doesn't guarantee success, but it puts us in the ball game. This collective community has a chance to do something really remarkable. I look forward to working with you to see that happen. Thank you so much. I'll take any questions you might have.
Don't forget the cards. If you would fill out a card each table, and people will be around to collect them. In the meantime, hello, Mr. Secretary. A lot of states are going to be competitive, as you noted. A lot of states are changing laws and regulations. What one or two distinctions will your department make to separate the winners from those who will have to come back again?
A couple things. First of all, we're going to do this in 2 rounds. So we're going to have a set of folks who will be approved in the first round, and everyone who doesn't will get sort of clear guidance as to what, where it didn't quite work out, and we'll have a second bite at the apple. And so this is one we want people to continue to learn and work together. At the end of the day, what we're really looking for is to invest in those states that had the capacity to do this work. And I'm sure we're going to get lots of fancy PowerPoint presentations and lots of good presentation on paper. what we're going to do is we're going to interview all the finalists and interview all the players and try as best we can read people's character, read their track record historically of doing this work, and try and best determine their ability to deliver. And so what I think is critically important is that if we want to have a race to the top 2 and a race to the top 3, 2, 3, 4 years from now, we as a country have to deliver in this first round. And so this isn't going to be rewarding, things around politics, around ideology, around feel-good stuff. We're going to be investing in places that have the capacity to deliver for children. And that's going to ultimately determine who gets resources and who doesn't.
Another question. How much of what we're seeing in Race to the Top is a foreshadowing of where the department and you will be on the reauthorization of ESEA and No Child Left Behind?
Yeah, well, I'm still, it's a big country I'm learning. I've been to about 32, 33 states. I'm learning everywhere I go. But as we think about No Child Left Behind reauthorization, there are a couple things that have troubled me with that. First of all, I want to focus much more on growth and gain rather than absolute test scores. Absolute test scores, I think, they tell you some things, but I think they mask a lot of things. And what I'm really interested in is how much are students improving every year. Just to give a quick example, if a child comes to you in 8th grade who's 3 grade levels behind and leaves you a grade level behind, that teacher has done an extraordinary job. That teacher has given you 2 years of growth, 4 years of instruction. That teacher should be a hero. We should be learning from that teacher. We should be finding out what worked there. That works for teachers, that works for grades, that works for schools. And we haven't focused enough on that. So really looking at how much folks are gaining. At the end of the day, I want to focus a lot more on graduation rates. You can have the best 3rd grade test scores in the world, but if you're still losing half your students to the streets, you can't go get a good job with a 3rd grade test score. Not too many employers are looking for that. So really focusing on outcomes, looking at gain, how do we reward excellence, and then at the bottom, I think No Child Left Behind labeled lots of schools failures. Many of those schools I think were actually successful, and so it was stigmatizing, it was humiliating, it was confusing to parents. Where schools are getting better, we want to recognize that gain. Where schools are struggling but starting to improve, we want to help that. And then I want to have a much more honest and more hard-nosed conversation at the bottom. Again, the bottom 1% where things simply aren't getting better. Let's come in and do something fundamentally different.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, a couple of months ago you made a speech where you talked about the importance of arts in education. What are you hearing at the national level about the impact of the arts in education? And how can that information be presented to school districts to keep the arts and arts education instead of being the first thing cut?
Yeah, 2 things have happened here that are really troubling. First, and they're related, one of the biggest fears, concerns I've heard everywhere I've gone, again, any state, rural, urban, suburban, doesn't matter, I consistently hear from parents and from teachers, is that under No Child Left Behind there's been a narrowing of the curriculum. And that what sort of gets tested gets taught. And so, great focus on reading, great focus on math, obviously that's fundamentally, hugely important. But how as we move forward, and this is one we're still really working through, how as we move forward do we really create an environment that encourages states and districts to provide students with a well-rounded curriculum? Art's a huge part of that. And when you couple a No Child Left Behind focus on those 2 areas and then tough budgetary cuts, guess what? Arts always get cut quickly. And so how, and to me this isn't just the high school level, but for our 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds, how do we expose them to art and music and dance and social studies and science? I'm a big fan of recess. I think we got to get more recess in our schools. Get students running around a little bit. So as we move forward, how do we think about all these things that aren't extra, that aren't extracurricular, that are normal in our best private schools, but often public schools seem to get cut. And we need to create incentive structures. We reauthorize the law that encourages schools and school districts to give every child a chance to fulfill their passions, get to know what they're good at. And I promise you, if you do those things well, guess what? Math and reading scores will also get better. These things aren't in conflict.
From your experiences in Chicago and with what you're seeing across the nation, what are 1 or 2 non-incremental best practices that you've found and can be shared?
Again, there are no silver bullets out there, and you guys have probably much better answers on that than I do. I would just say, repeat what I said before, that thinking about how we systemically, not just through good luck, how do we systemically get our best teachers and our best principals working with the children who need the most help? And where we have schools doing that today, rural, urban, suburban, we see remarkable things going on, but that's the exception rather than norm. And then secondly, how do we really think about the schools themselves in very different ways. I think schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week, 11, 12 months out of the year. We just need more time with our children. Schools should be community centers, open for parents, GED, ESL, family literacy nights. The ideas of schools being open 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months of the year just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Mr. Secretary, Race to the Top focuses a great deal on student growth, which is critical. But right now, schools are limited to, under NCLB, to grade level tests, the so-called end-of-the-year test. Will you seek to allow adaptive tests to more accurately measure longitudinal growth?
Yeah, and again, that really goes back to when we talk about better, not just higher standards, but better assessments. And so we're going to go through a bit of a transition period now with states and with districts for the next year or two, and we got to sort of figure that out. But ultimately, if we have much better assessments that aren't filling the bubble, that really assess our students' critical thinking skills, and allow districts to not just at end of years, but throughout the course of a year, understand strengths and weaknesses, I think we can fundamentally break through on this. So that's exactly where we're trying to go.
I know you have limited time, so I have one really final important question.
All right.
Do you and Reggie Love have to be on different teams when you play with the president in pickup games?
I'll plead the fifth on that. Give me one more question.
Delaware spent a lot of time in the last 10 years, mostly with Wallace Foundation grants, to really develop a cohesive leadership system, includes standards, training, and working conditions for school leaders. How important is it, in your judgment, that we develop these school leaders?
Yeah, and again, all these things are important, but I say all the time, there are no good schools without good principals. They just don't exist. And so you can make a pretty good case that this is maybe the most important thing we can do. And I've actually seen quite the opposite. I've seen schools that, with the right leader, have gotten better for 6, 8, 10, 12 years, and without the right succession plan and the wrong successor comes in, that school's a disaster in 6 months. It is like so much harder to build things up than it is to tear it down. So how we train our principals, how we create the right pipelines. Our principals today are CEOs. They have to manage multi-million-dollar budgets. They have to manage people. They have to be an HR expert. They have to work with the community. They have to be first and foremost instructional leaders. And we can't do enough to figure out how we get the best and brightest to become principals who want to do that, how we help to create a pipeline where they get to grow. We need like a master rung on the principal ladder. We have national board certification for teachers. We don't have an equivalent on the principal side. And then ultimately how we get those principals that are doing the best job of driving student achievement to take on the toughest assignments. And so I think there's a huge amount of work we need to do that well. When I talk about getting great teachers into struggling schools, if you throw $3,000 or $5,000 at a teacher, they'll laugh at you for that. You know, they're not going to do that. If you put some real money on the table, but most importantly, if you put a great principal in there with them and let them go with a cohort of folks, then you got a bargain. You got a chance to do it. Working conditions are so hugely important. When teachers, and we lose far too many of our good young teachers, when teachers leave education, money is like the 6th or 7th thing on the list. It's always a lack of support, and that support always starts at the top. So whether it's for our students' benefit, whether it's for the entire benefit of the educational system and keeping our pipelines of talent in education, getting great principals into every single school is a huge, huge part of the solution. And getting the best of the best where we need them the most, I think will take us to a different level.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.